The morning of July 3, 2009, arrived with the kind of heat that makes asphalt shimmer. At Lake Peyton, 40 miles north of the Oregon-Idaho border, the air hung thick and still, broken only by the rhythmic slap of water against aluminum hulls and the distant whine of a two-stroke engine being coaxed to life. Claire Brennan stood barefoot on the weathered dock, toes curled over the edge, where the wood had gone soft from decades of moisture, watching her 6-year-old twins race each other across the gravel lot toward the rental cabin. Their voices carried across the water, high, bright, unself-conscious. She held their turquoise life jackets in one hand, the bulky kind with reflective tape and plastic buckles that always jammed, and a plastic grocery bag filled with sunscreen and granola bars in the other. The morning smelled like gasoline and coconut SPF and the faint vegetal rot of algae warming in the shallows. She remembers noticing that one of the life jacket buckles had frayed, the nylon webbing coming apart in thin white threads. She made a mental note to ask the marina attendant for a replacement before they went out on the water. By sunset, her husband would be gone, and those life jackets would become evidence item 7 in a case file that would remain open for 8 years. Daniel Brennan was 34 years old that summer, a hydraulics engineer who worked for the Municipal Water Authority in Boise. He had a crooked front tooth that made his smile asymmetrical, a quiet laugh that came from his chest, and the habit of humming under his breath when he was concentrating on something, usually old folk songs his grandmother had taught him as a child. On the morning of July 3rd, he stood at the cabin's propane stove, making scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar, the kind that came in a block and had to be grated by hand. He poured orange juice into plastic cups with cartoon characters on them, wiped down the sticky pine table with a damp dishcloth, and told Devon and Audrey they were going to catch bass so big they'd need 2 hands to hold them. Claire remembers the texture of that moment, with the kind of clarity trauma burns into memory. The metallic click of the spatula against the cast-iron pan, the smell of butter browning too fast, the sticky residue of syrup on the table that wouldn't come off no matter how hard Daniel scrubbed, the way his voice softened and dropped half an octave when he reminded the kids to stay in sight of shore. He wore a faded grey t-shirt with a college logo that had cracked and peeled from too many washes, cargo shorts with an impractical number of pockets, and old running shoes with the laces double-knotted. Around his left wrist, barely visible beneath his watch, he wore a braided paracord bracelet in forest green and burnt orange. Devon had made it for him 3 weeks earlier for Father's Day, following instructions from a YouTube video, his small fingers fumbling with the knots until Daniel helped him finish. Claire can still picture the bracelet catching the morning light as Daniel reached across the table for the boat keys, the way the colors seemed to glow against his tanned skin. They set out just after 9 o'clock. The lake stretched before them, its surface smooth as poured resin, silvered by high clouds that promised heat but no rain. Daniel piloted their borrowed boat, a 14-foot Lund skiff with cream-colored fiberglass and a 15-horsepower Yamaha outboard that had seen better days, while Claire and the twins sat on the forward bench, trailing their fingers in the water and watching minnows scatter in the boat's shadow. The air moving across the lake was 10 degrees cooler than on shore, and it carried the scent of pine resin and wild mint from the banks. They motored east along the shoreline for 20 minutes, past summer homes with private docks and floating swim platforms, past stands of ponderosa pine that came down to the water's edge until they reached a cove on the lake's eastern arm. A natural bowl of still water ringed by trees, the kind of place that held fish in the heat of the day. Daniel cut the engine and let the boat drift while he assembled the kids' fishing rods, threading line through guides and tying on hooks with the patient precision he brought to everything. They anchored in 8 feet of water. The twins fished with bobbers and worms dug from the cabin's compost pile that morning, their lines tangling every few minutes, while Claire sat on the middle bench reading a paperback mystery she'd bought at a grocery store in Boise and reapplying SPF 50 every hour, setting a timer on her phone so she wouldn't forget. Daniel paddled the perimeter of the cove in the orange kayak they'd strapped to the boat's stern, checking depth with a handheld fish finder and making notes on a laminated map of the lake he'd picked up at the ranger station. The morning stretched and settled into the comfortable rhythm of family vacation, unhurried, unstructured, punctuated by small victories, when Audrey caught a 6-inch bluegill and Devon's bobber disappeared underwater, only to reveal a stick snagged on his hook. Round 2 in the afternoon, as the sun climbed directly overhead and the air in the cove went still and heavy, Daniel paddled back to the boat and announced he was going to run back to the marina for ice and hot dogs. The cooler was running warm, condensation pooling in the bottom, and the twins were starting to get hungry in that particular way 6-year-olds do, their energy turning from playful to irritable. It was a 7-minute trip by motor across open water. Claire remembers asking if he wanted company, remembers him shaking his head and smiling, saying he'd be back in 20 minutes, 30 tops. She remembers watching him transfer from the kayak into the skiff, steadying himself with one hand on the gunwale, remembers the sound of the starter cord being pulled once, twice, then the engine catching and settling into a steady idle. He gave a small wave, casual, unhurried, and turned the bow west toward the main basin where the marina sat at the lake's southern end. Claire watched until the boat became a white speck against the darker water, then turned her attention back to Devon, who had managed to tangle his line around Audrey's and was on the verge of tears. She untangled them, baited fresh hooks, and checked her phone. 2:17. She remembers the exact time because she made a mental note that they'd need to start heading back to the cabin by 4 if they wanted to shower before dinner. That was the last time anyone who loved Daniel Brennan saw him whole and present in the world he'd been born into. 20 minutes became 40, then an hour. Claire tried his cell phone at 2:50. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, his recorded voice cheerful and efficient. "You've reached Daniel, leave a message." She tried again at 3:15. Same result. The lake had cell coverage, but it was patchy in the coves, so she wasn't immediately alarmed. She told herself he'd gotten caught in line at the marina store, or stopped to chat with someone about fishing conditions, or decided to grab lunch. But by 3:30, her chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. She paddled the kayak 100 yards out of the cove toward open water, shading her eyes against the glare, scanning the lake's surface for a cream-colored boat. She saw pontoons, ski boats, a cluster of jet skis near the north shore, but no Lund skiff. By 4 o'clock, she'd flagged down a passing pontoon boat, a family from Spokane, the father sunburned and helpful, and asked him to radio the marina and inquire if anyone had seen Daniel. The man's wife stayed with Claire and the twins while he motored away. 15 minutes later, he returned, his expression grave, and said the harbour master needed to speak with her immediately. By 4:15, Claire was standing on the main dock at the marina, twins silent beside her, talking to a Fremont County Sheriff's deputy named Ortiz, who looked about 25 and kept touching his radio as if he expected it to provide answers. The skiff had been found adrift near the western boat ramp at 3:40. Engine off, keys in the ignition, Daniel's wallet and phone sitting side by side on the rear bench seat, like items arranged for a photograph. No blood, no signs of struggle, no damage to the boat, no Daniel. If you're watching this, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us bring you more stories like this one, stories that need to be told and remembered. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from tonight? We love hearing from you. The search began within 90 minutes of Claire's call. Sheriff's deputies from Fremont County coordinated with Idaho Fish and Game officers who launched 2 aluminum patrol boats equipped with side-scan sonar units borrowed from the state police. A volunteer search and rescue team arrived by 6 p.m. in a convoy of pickup trucks, bringing dive gear, grappling hooks, waterproof radios, and a German shepherd named Maggie trained for water recovery. The July evening was long and golden, the sun not setting until after 9, which gave searchers hours of good light. Maggie worked the shoreline near the boat ramp with her handler, a retired forest ranger named Bill, who spoke to the dog in a constant low murmur, nose low to the mud and sand, pacing back and forth along a 30-foot stretch of beach before sitting abruptly, a passive alert indicating human scent. Divers went down in water that was murky with suspended sediment, visibility measured in inches, feeling through silt and submerged logs with gloved hands, working in 15-minute rotations because the cold at depth was numbing even in July. They found a plastic tackle box with rusted hinges, a beer can, a child's foam pool noodle faded to the color of old bone, but no body, no clothing, no evidence of Daniel Brennan. By nightfall, the lake's surface was crisscrossed with searchlight beams, and the sound of outboard motors echoed off the surrounding hills. The Fremont County Sheriff, a lean man in his 50s named Gerald Peterson, known locally for methodical competence and a temperament that never rose to panic, held a brief press conference in the marina's gravel parking lot under the harsh glare of television lights. He described Daniel as 6'1", 180 pounds, brown hair, hazel eyes, last seen wearing grey and khaki. He asked anyone who had been on the water that afternoon to come forward with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem. Witnesses emerged slowly, their accounts fragmented and uncertain. A logger named Bill Hagan, who had been loading firewood from his property near the North Access Road, told deputies he'd seen a man matching Daniel's description standing near a white pickup truck around 2:30, engaged in conversation with another man. Shorter, stocky build, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. Hagan couldn't hear what they were saying, but the body language looked casual, unhurried, not confrontational. The truck had out-of-state plates, but Hagan couldn't remember which state. Maybe California, maybe Washington. The sun had been in his eyes. A clerk at the marina's convenience store, a college student named Brittany, who was working the summer for tuition money, remembered selling a bag of ice to a man in a grey shirt around 2:45. But when shown Daniel's photo, she couldn't be certain it was him. She'd rung up 6 customers in that 15-minute window, and they all blurred together. The most promising lead came from a teenage girl named Kira Boswell, who had been jet skiing with 3 friends near the western boat ramp that afternoon. She told investigators, her voice tentative and apologetic, that she thought she might have seen a man who could have been Daniel sitting on the back bench of a motorboat near the ramp around 3 p.m., but she wasn't certain, couldn't swear to it. The boat, she said, had been a dark color, blue or green, maybe black, and there had been 2 people aboard, maybe 3. She'd been going fast and only glanced. A forensic sketch artist from the state police worked with Kira for 2 hours in a conference room at the sheriff's office, but the composite image that emerged was too vague to be useful. Generic features, average build, nothing distinctive. By the 3rd day, Kira's mother called the sheriff's office to say her daughter was having nightmares about being wrong, about sending the investigation in the wrong direction, and couldn't participate further. The lead, such as it was, went cold. The search effort consumed the lake and surrounding area for the next 72 hours. Teams worked in overlapping grids, using side-scan sonar units that could map the lake bottom in real time, searching for anomalies, shapes that didn't belong, densities that suggested human remains. Cadaver dogs walked every trail within a 2-mile radius, their handlers moving slowly through dense undergrowth, marking locations where the dogs showed interest. A helicopter from the Idaho National Guard made low passes over the water, its rotor wash kicking up whitecaps and sending small boats scrambling for cover, while an observer with binoculars scanned the surface and shoreline. Flyers went up on every bulletin board, storefront window, and gas station within 50 miles. Daniel's face smiling from a candid photo taken at Devon's 6th birthday party 3 months earlier, his crooked tooth visible, the word "missing" printed in red block letters above a phone number for the tip line. In the first week, the tip line received 73 calls. Most were well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful. Sightings of men who vaguely resembled Daniel but turned out to be tourists, hikers, locals going about their ordinary lives. One caller, an elderly woman from Pocatello who spoke in a breathless rush, insisted she'd seen Daniel at a truck stop near Twin Falls, sitting alone in a corner booth drinking coffee and looking lost. Deputies drove to Twin Falls, reviewed security footage from the truck stop, and confirmed it was someone else entirely. Similar build, similar coloring, but definitively not Daniel Brennan. Another caller, who refused to give his name and spoke in conspiratorial whispers, claimed Daniel had been abducted by a doomsday cult operating out of a fortified compound in northern Nevada. Investigators followed up on every lead, no matter how implausible, documenting each one in the growing case file, and each one led precisely nowhere. Claire Brennan's world fractured cleanly into before and after, the line of demarcation drawn at 2:17 p.m. on July 3, 2009. She stayed with her parents in Boise after the first week of searching. They had flown in from Sacramento the night Daniel disappeared. Her mother moving through Claire's house with quiet efficiency, washing dishes and folding laundry, while her father dealt with phone calls and paperwork. The twins stopped talking about their father in the present tense within a week, some survival instinct teaching them to protect themselves from hope that might shatter. Devon began wetting the bed, something he hadn't done since he was 3. Waking up crying and ashamed while Claire changed sheets at 2 a.m. and whispered that it was okay, that bodies sometimes did things we couldn't control. Audrey stopped drawing the cheerful pictures she used to make, families and houses and gardens, and started drawing boats, always empty, floating on expanses of blue. Claire returned to her job as a part-time grant writer for a non-profit arts collective in downtown Boise, but her focus dissolved like sugar in water. She would sit at her desk staring at her computer screen, the cursor blinking in an empty document, unable to remember what she was supposed to be writing or why it mattered. She missed deadlines for the first time in her career, forgot about meetings until someone called looking for her, and spent hours refreshing her email, hoping for news that never came. Friends organized meal trains, showing up at her door with casseroles in disposable aluminum pans and sympathetic expressions they'd clearly rehearsed. They sat with her in her living room, making small talk about weather and neighborhood news, because there was nothing useful to say about a husband who had vanished into air. The question everyone wanted to ask but couldn't, did he leave on purpose? Did he choose this, hung in every room like smoke you couldn't clear? Financial investigators combed through Daniel's life looking for hidden fault lines. His bank accounts showed no unusual activity in the weeks or months before the disappearance. Regular deposits of his bi-weekly paycheck, regular withdrawals for groceries and gas, and the twins' swimming lessons. His credit cards hadn't been used since July 2nd, when he'd charged $43 at a sporting goods store for new fishing line and a package of hooks. There was no evidence of gambling, no large cash withdrawals, no pattern of deception. His email and social media accounts, which Claire gave investigators permission to access, contained nothing suspicious. Work correspondence, family photos, a thread with his college roommate about maybe meeting up for a Boise State game in the fall. There was no history of depression, no previous suicide attempts, no indication he'd been struggling. His primary care physician told investigators Daniel had come in for a routine physical in April and been given a clean bill of health. Blood pressure normal, cholesterol a little high, but nothing concerning, no medications, no red flags. He was, by every measure and every account, a devoted father and steady husband who loved his job and looked forward to teaching his children to fish. His supervisor at the Water Authority, a woman named Glenda who had worked with Daniel for 6 years, told detectives that he was meticulous and reliable, the kind of engineer who color-coded his file folders and never missed a deadline, who volunteered to take on extra projects and stayed late when systems needed attention. His sister Jen, who lived in Portland with her partner and 2 kids, told investigators through tears that Daniel had called her the week before the Lake Peyton trip, excited about the vacation, talking about how fast the twins were growing and how he wanted to make sure they knew how to be safe on the water. There was no note, no goodbye, no digital footprint that suggested planning. And yet, the absence of a body left a space where doubt could grow. The cruelest kind of ambiguity, the kind that prevents mourning from ever becoming complete. Months became seasons, became years. Claire marked time by the twins' milestones, because her own life felt suspended. First day of 2nd grade, Halloween costumes, the December morning when Audrey asked, her voice small and uncertain, whether Daddy was in heaven or just lost somewhere he couldn't find his way back from. Claire didn't know how to answer. She said something vague about not knowing, about holding both possibilities at once. And Audrey nodded and went back to her cereal and never asked again. The sheriff's department kept the case open, but scaled back active investigation after the first year. There were other cases, other emergencies, finite resources. Detective Lila Yamada, a soft-spoken woman in her early 50s with a background in missing persons cases and a reputation for never giving up, stayed in touch with Claire, calling every few months to check in and review any new information that might have surfaced. There wasn't much. A hiker found a tattered grey T-shirt near a trailhead 20 miles from Lake Peyton in the spring of 2010. It was sent to the state crime lab for DNA testing and ruled out as Daniel's after 3 weeks. A fisherman reported seeing what looked like a submerged body near the lake's southern inlet in August 2011. Divers went down and found a rolled-up tarp weighted with rocks. Someone's illegal dump, unrelated to the case. The file grew thicker. Pages of reports and witness statements and forensic analyses, but the core mystery remained untouched. Claire began attending a support group for families of the missing in the fall of 2010. It met every Thursday evening in the basement of a Lutheran church on the west side of Boise, in a room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs arranged in a circle and a coffee maker that produced something brown and bitter but caffeinated. She met people whose loved ones had been gone for 5 years, 10 years, 2 decades. A man whose son had disappeared while backpacking in Montana in 1995. A woman whose sister had walked out of a hospital in 2003 and never returned. A couple whose adult daughter had vanished after a first date that ended somewhere between a restaurant and her apartment. They spoke a language Claire was learning to understand. Ambiguous loss, the facilitator called it, a kind of mourning without closure, grief without permission to fully grieve. Some members of the group had declared their missing loved ones legally dead after the required waiting period and held memorial services, cremating or burying empty caskets, trying to create an ending where none existed. Others refused, clinging to the statistical possibility of return, keeping bedrooms unchanged and phones active and hope carefully rationed. Claire fell somewhere in between. She kept Daniel's clothes in the closet, but couldn't bring herself to wear his wedding ring on a chain around her neck the way some widows did. She existed in a state of suspension, neither married nor single, neither hopeful nor resigned, moving through her days with a sense of unreality that never quite lifted. The financial strain compounded the emotional toll in ways Claire hadn't anticipated. Daniel's paycheck had covered the mortgage and most of the utilities. Her part-time income wasn't enough to sustain their household. She applied for Social Security survivor benefits in early 2010, filling out forms and providing documentation, but was denied. Without a body or a legal declaration of death, Daniel was considered missing, not deceased, and the benefits weren't available. The mortgage company was sympathetic but inflexible. They offered her a temporary forbearance but made it clear that payments would eventually need to resume. She refinanced at a higher interest rate, took on a second job transcribing medical records from home in the evenings after the twins went to bed, and sold Daniel's truck to a neighbor for less than it was worth because she needed the cash immediately. The twins started asking why they couldn't go to summer camp like their friends, why they couldn't sign up for soccer, why they had to share a bedroom now that they'd moved to a smaller apartment. Claire explained, in language they could understand, that money was tight, that they had to be careful, that they were managing. She didn't tell them that she lay awake at 3 a.m. doing math in her head, calculating how many months she could cover rent and groceries and insurance if she got more transcription work, if she skipped her own meals, if nothing else went wrong. She didn't tell them that she sometimes stood in the shower crying silently so they wouldn't hear, or that she occasionally imagined Daniel walking through the door with an explanation that would make sense of everything. Amnesia, abduction, witness protection, anything that would mean he hadn't chosen to leave. By 2012, the case had gone cold in every practical sense. Lila Yamada retired from the sheriff's department that spring and moved to Boise to be closer to her grandchildren. Before she left, she stopped by Claire's apartment with a cardboard box containing copies of every report, every witness statement, every photograph from the original investigation. "In case you ever want to look through it yourself," Yamada said quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression gentle and sad. "Sometimes families see things we miss. Sometimes it helps to have it." Claire thanked her, carried the box inside, and put it in the hall closet behind winter coats and boxes of outgrown kids' clothes, where it sat untouched for 3 years. The twins were in middle school now, gangly and hormonal, navigating a landscape of social hierarchies and standardized tests and a world that had mostly forgotten their father. People stopped asking Claire about Daniel, stopped offering condolences, assumed she'd moved on, because enough time had passed that moving on seemed reasonable. She went on occasional dates, tentative dinners with kind men she met through work or friends, men who seemed genuinely interested until she explained her situation, husband missing, not dead, no closure, and they politely withdrew, unable or unwilling to navigate that complexity. None of it went anywhere. How do you build a future when the past refuses to settle into a shape you can understand? Then, on a Saturday in August 2017, Claire took Devon and Audrey to Lake Peyton for the first time since the disappearance. It was Devon's idea. He was 15 now, thoughtful and serious, and he'd been reading about exposure therapy in his high school psychology class. He thought that facing the place might help them all process what had happened, might give them some kind of closure, even if they never had answers. Audrey, now also 15 and more skeptical of therapeutic intervention, was less enthusiastic but agreed to go. They rented a cabin from a different marina on the opposite shore from where they'd stayed 8 years earlier. The lake looked different and the same, more developed, more boats. A floating inflatable obstacle course anchored in the main basin where kids in life jackets climbed and jumped and screamed with delight, but the air still smelled like sunscreen and gasoline and the particular vegetal scent of lake water warming in the sun. Claire felt nauseated the entire 2-hour drive from Boise, her hands clenched on the steering wheel, but the twins wanted to try this, and she owed them the attempt. On Sunday morning, they walked down to the public dock to watch boats come and go. It was a warm morning, temperature already in the mid-70s by 9 a.m., with a light breeze coming off the water that carried the sound of laughter and outboard motors. Claire stood with her hands in the pockets of her shorts, half listening as Devon pointed out different types of boats and explained their hull designs and propulsion systems. He'd become interested in marine engineering, perhaps unconsciously drawn to the last thing his father had been doing. Audrey was taking photos with her phone, composing careful shots of the water and the tree line and the way light reflected off ripples, thinking maybe about using them for her photography class portfolio. The dock was busy with weekend traffic, families loading coolers, fishermen checking tackle, teenagers in swimsuits running despite the signs that said not to. And then, at precisely 10:43 a.m., according to the timestamp on the photo Audrey took seconds later, a man in a navy windbreaker and wraparound sunglasses guided a small motorboat, white fiberglass, modest outboard, similar to the one that had been found adrift 8 years earlier, into the dock 50 feet to their left. 2 children sat in the bow, maybe 8 and 10 years old, both wearing neon yellow life jackets that were too big for their frames. The man cut the engine with practiced efficiency, let the boat glide the last few feet, and looped the bowline around a cleat with movements that were economical and certain. He turned to help the older child out of the boat, reaching down with his left hand, and as he did, he lifted his sunglasses briefly to wipe sweat from his forehead with his right forearm. Claire's breath stopped. Time seemed to slow and thicken, the crooked front tooth, the particular shape of his jaw, the way it angled from ear to chin, the way his left hand moved, quick, economical, the fingers spread just so as he secured the stern line. And there, just visible below the cuff of his windbreaker as he reached up to push his sunglasses back in place, a flash of forest green and burnt orange. She didn't scream, didn't gasp or cry out. For a long, suspended moment, she simply stood completely still, feeling the earth tilt beneath her feet, feeling 8 years collapse into nothing. Devon noticed first. "Mom?" he said, his voice uncertain, picking up on some change in her posture or breathing. Claire's hand shot out, gripping his shoulder hard enough that he winced. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Both of you. Don't move." Then she walked, slowly, deliberately, every step requiring conscious effort, down the dock toward the man and the 2 children. He saw her when she was still 10 feet away. His entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face. The older child was saying something about needing to use the restroom, pointing toward the marina building, but the man had gone completely still, every muscle locked, his eyes fixed on Claire's face with an expression she couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something else, something like recognition mixed with dread. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough to see the small scar on his left eyebrow from the bike accident when he was 9, close enough to smell motor oil and sunscreen and lake water, close enough to see the exact color of his eyes, hazel with flecks of gold, the same eyes she'd looked into on their wedding day. "Daniel," she said, not a question, a statement, a confirmation of something impossible. He opened his mouth, closed it. His hands hung at his sides, fingers flexing. The younger child, a girl with dark braids and a dusting of freckles across her nose, tugged at his sleeve. "Dad?" she said, her voice uncertain, looking between the 2 adults with the particular confusion children feel when they sense tension they can't name. The word "Dad" hit Claire like a physical blow. She looked at the children. Neither of them resembled Daniel. Both had darker skin and different bone structure, clearly not his biological offspring. And then back at his face. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steadier than she had any right to feel, adrenaline doing the work that emotion couldn't. "Right now." Daniel, because it was absolutely impossibly him, nodded once, a small jerky movement, and turned to the older child, a boy with serious dark eyes and a San Francisco Giants cap. "Take your sister to the restroom," he said quietly, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar in its cadence. "I'll meet you at the truck in 10 minutes. Don't leave the parking lot." The boy hesitated, looking at Claire with cautious curiosity, then took his sister's hand and led her up the dock toward the marina building. Daniel watched them until they disappeared around the corner, then turned back to Claire. His hands were shaking. "I didn't think—" he began, then stopped. "I never thought I'd see you here. I didn't know you'd come back." "You've been alive," Claire said. It wasn't an accusation yet, just an observation, flat and strange and obvious. "Yes," His voice was barely above a whisper. "You let us think you were dead." The words came out harder than she intended, 8 years of unresolved grief sharpening them into weapons. "I didn't—" He broke off, rubbing his face with both hands. A gesture she remembered, a gesture from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "It's complicated. I don't know how to explain." Claire felt Devon and Audrey approach behind her, heard Audrey's sharp intake of breath. "Is that— oh my God, is that—" Audrey's voice was high and tight, not quite believing. "Yes," Claire said, not taking her eyes off Daniel. "It's him." Daniel looked past Claire at the twins, his twins, 15 years old now, nearly grown, strangers wearing familiar faces. His expression crumbled. "Devon," he said softly, his voice breaking on the name. "Audrey, you're so—" He stopped himself, seemed to realize how inadequate any words would be. Devon and Audrey stood frozen, holding each other's hands in a way they hadn't since they were small, staring at him as if he were something from a dream, something that violated every law of reality they'd built their lives around. "You need to come with me," Claire said to Daniel, her voice rising now, control starting to fray. "To the sheriff's office. Right now. You're going to explain everything." Daniel flinched, glanced toward the parking lot where the children had disappeared. "I have to take care of them first," he said. They don't know they don't know who I am. I need to—" "Know what?" Claire's voice was louder now, drawing looks from other people on the dock. "That you're married? That you have kids? That you disappeared and destroyed us?" She stopped herself, aware they were creating a scene, aware of the teenagers filming with their phones, aware that whatever happened next would become public. Daniel looked at the dock planking, at his hands, anywhere but at her face. "I'll explain everything," he said. "I promise. Just give me an hour. Meet me at the ranger station at noon. I'll tell you everything." "No," Claire said flatly. "Now, right now. Or I call the police, and they take you into custody." Daniel's shoulders sagged. He pulled his phone from his pocket. New model, not the one that had been found in the boat 8 years ago, and dialed. "It's me," he said quietly. "I need you to come pick up the kids at Lake Peyton, North Marina. It's an emergency." He listened for a moment. "I can't explain now. Please just come. I'm sorry." He ended the call and looked at Claire. "Okay," he said. "Let's go." A woman named Julia arrived 23 minutes later in a silver sedan with Washington plates. She was in her early 40s, with shoulder-length brown hair and an expression of deep concern that shifted to confusion when she saw Claire and the twins. Daniel spoke to her briefly, his voice too low for Claire to hear, while the 2 children climbed into the car. Julia kept looking at Claire, her confusion deepening into something like comprehension and horror. She said something sharp to Daniel. Claire caught the words, "told me" and "truth," and then got in the car and drove away without looking back. Daniel stood in the parking lot with his hands in his pockets, looking smaller somehow, diminished, and said, "Where to?" They drove in Claire's SUV, all 4 of them, the silence in the vehicle thick and suffocating, to the Fremont County Sheriff's substation, a low brick building on the edge of town with a parking lot full of patrol vehicles. Inside, a deputy named Ortiz, who looked maybe 30 and seemed competent despite his obvious shock at the situation being explained to him, ushered them into an interview room with cinder block walls, painted institutional beige, and a table bolted to the floor. Devon and Audrey sat outside in a waiting area with a victim advocate named Karen, who offered them water and granola bars and said nothing, understanding that words would be useless. Inside the interview room, Daniel sat across from Claire at the scarred table, hands folded, and began to speak. He had not been abducted. He had not been coerced or threatened or held against his will. On July 3, 2009, at approximately 2:40 p.m., Daniel Brennan had made a choice, impulsive and unplanned, but deliberate nonetheless. He had gone to the marina as promised, bought a bag of ice from the convenience store, and was walking back toward the dock, where the boat was tied up when a man approached him in the parking lot. The man said his name was Gregor, that he was from Moldova, that he was in his mid-40s and desperate. He was out of status on his visa, facing deportation, and had a sister in Vancouver who was dying of cancer. He needed to cross into Canada using credible documents. He offered Daniel $2,000 in cash. Right there, bills in a worn duffel bag, 20s and 50s and hundreds, to trade identities for 48 hours. He just needed Daniel's driver's license and credit card, would return them by mail once he was across the border, swore he wasn't a criminal, just a man trying to get to his family. It was absurd. It was illegal. It should have been an immediate, obvious no. But Daniel, in a moment he still couldn't fully explain or justify, said yes. He told himself it was temporary, that he'd take the money, $2,000 they desperately needed, could put toward the twins' college fund or home repairs, help someone in genuine crisis, and be back by Monday with a story about getting lost in the woods overnight, about his boat drifting away, about any of a dozen plausible scenarios. He took the cash, gave Gregor his wallet, and climbed into Gregor's pickup truck. Before they drove away, Daniel walked back to the boat, the Lund skiff bobbing gently at the dock, and placed his wallet and phone on the rear bench seat, arranging them carefully. He told himself it would look like he'd dropped them getting out of the boat, like he'd slipped and fallen overboard, like there had been an accident. It would explain his absence until he came back. They drove north on Highway 20, then east on smaller roads, heading toward the Canadian border. And somewhere during that 3-hour drive, as the landscape changed from pine forests to high prairie, something shifted in Daniel's mind. He started imagining what it would be like to not go back, to be nobody, to escape the weight of responsibility. The mortgage, the job that was fine but not fulfilling, the constant low-level anxiety of adult life, the sense that he was living someone else's idea of success rather than his own. By the time they reached the border crossing at Eastport, Idaho, near midnight, Daniel had made a decision that would define the next 8 years of his life. Gregor gave him a passport, purchased, Daniel later learned, from a document forger in Portland, that had been crudely doctored to show Daniel's photo, but a different name, Andrei Kostin, Romanian national, age 32. The quality was poor, but land border crossings in 2009 were less rigorous than they would become later. Daniel crossed into British Columbia as Andrei Kostin at 12:40 a.m. on July 4, 2009. Gregor went his own way. Daniel never saw or heard from him again, and Daniel kept driving north. He ditched the passport at a rest stop 2 days later, terrified of being caught with fraudulent documents, and started working under the table, cash only, no questions asked. He washed dishes in a diner in Cranbrook, BC. He worked construction in Kelowna. He did landscaping in Kamloops. He moved through small towns and cities in the interior of British Columbia, staying nowhere longer than a few months, avoiding cameras, paying cash for everything, never using his real name or social security number. He grew a beard. He cut his hair short, then let it grow long. He became good at being invisible. The guilt was constant and physical, a weight in his chest that never lifted. He thought about Claire and the twins every single day, every morning when he woke up, every night before he slept, hundreds of times in between. He composed letters in his head, elaborate explanations and apologies, but he never wrote them down because he knew there was no explanation adequate to the harm he'd caused. He told himself he would go back once he figured out how to make it right, once he had a story that made sense, once enough time had passed that maybe they could forgive him. But weeks became months, and the window for return closed. How do you come back from that? How do you walk through the door after 3 months, 6 months, a year, and say, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake"? The longer he stayed away, the more impossible return became. In the fall of 2011, Daniel was working at a community garden in Medford, Oregon. He drifted south back across the border into the US using back roads and avoiding checkpoints when he met Julia. She was a social worker specializing in refugee resettlement, helping immigrant families navigate the bureaucratic maze of asylum and work permits. She volunteered at the garden on weekends. They started talking. He told her his name was Andre, that he'd fled an abusive situation in Romania, that he was rebuilding his life and trying to stay under the radar. She asked few questions, accepting his story at face value, offering kindness without judgment. They became friends, then more. They moved in together in 2012. In 2013, they had a small commitment ceremony in her living room, not legally binding, no marriage license, just a symbolic exchange of vows in front of 10 friends. Julia had 2 children from a previous relationship, a boy named Marcus and a girl named Lily. Daniel became their stepfather in every way that mattered, except legally. He helped with homework. He taught them to ride bikes. He loved them. That was the part that made Claire's hands shake as she sat across the table in the interview room, hearing him say, his voice steady and clear, that he had loved other children while his own grew up wondering if their father was dead or had abandoned them by choice. Deputy Ortiz took notes, his pen moving steadily across lined paper. When Daniel finished speaking, there was a long silence. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The bracelet, you kept it." It wasn't a question. Daniel looked down at his wrist. He'd rolled up his sleeve during the interview. The paracord bracelet was still there, faded from sun and water, fraying at the edges but intact. The forest green had grayed, the burnt orange muted to rust, but it was unmistakably the same one Devon had made 8 years earlier. "I couldn't take it off," Daniel said quietly. "Every time I thought about it, I'd remember him making it, his little fingers trying to tie the knots. How proud he was when he gave it to me. I wore it every day. It was the only thing I kept." Claire stood abruptly, her chair scraping across linoleum. "I need air," she said, and walked out of the room without looking back. The legal aftermath was complicated and drawn out. Daniel Brennan had not technically committed a crime by disappearing. American adults have the constitutional right to walk away from their lives, to start over, to leave without explanation. But he had used fraudulent identification documents to cross an international border, had lived under a false name, had worked illegally using false information, and had allowed a massive search and rescue operation to proceed knowing he was alive. Federal authorities became involved. Immigration and Customs Enforcement opened a file. The FBI interviewed him twice, documenting his movements and tracking down Gregor, who was eventually located in Toronto, confirmed parts of Daniel's story, and faced his own charges related to document fraud. In December 2017, federal prosecutors charged Daniel with passport fraud and aggravated identity theft, both federal offenses carrying potential prison time. His court-appointed attorney negotiated a plea deal. Daniel pled guilty to both charges, cooperated fully with investigators, and in March 2018 was sentenced to 18 months in a minimum security federal correctional facility in Sheridan, Oregon, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Claire did not attend the sentencing hearing. She stayed in Boise with the twins, working with Dr. Neil Granger, a therapist who specialized in complex trauma and family reunification. Dr. Granger was a patient man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet voice, and he used terms like ambiguous loss resolution and complex grief processing and identity dissonance, helping the twins understand that their feelings, anger, confusion, relief, betrayal, grief for the father they'd lost even though he was alive, were all valid and could all exist simultaneously. Devon wanted nothing to do with Daniel. He refused to speak his name, referred to him only as him, and told Dr. Granger in session that he'd rather have a dead father than one who chose to leave. Audrey oscillated wildly between rage and desperate sadness, writing long letters to Daniel that she never sent, filling notebooks with questions she couldn't answer. Daniel served his sentence at FCI Sheridan, working in the prison library and attending therapy groups for men dealing with guilt and accountability. He was released in September 2019 after 15 months, the remainder of his sentence reduced for good behavior. Julia had left him by then. She'd felt used and betrayed, realizing the man she'd built a life with had been a fiction, and she wanted nothing more to do with him. The divorce, such as it was given, they'd never been legally married, was swift and total. Marcus and Lily stayed with her. Daniel had no legal rights to them, and Julia made clear he wasn't welcome in their lives. Daniel moved into a halfway house in Boise, worked the night shift at an Amazon warehouse sorting packages, and began the slow, uncertain, probably impossible process of trying to reconnect with Devon and Audrey. It was not a tearful reunion. There were no embrace or forgiveness or healing. It was awkward and painful and mediated every step of the way by Dr. Granger, who established strict boundaries and let the twins set the pace. Devon allowed supervised phone calls once a month, brief and stilted, never lasting more than 10 minutes. Audrey refused any contact for the first year, then slowly softened, agreeing to exchange emails, short, carefully worded messages about safe topics like weather and school. Claire stayed on the periphery, neither encouraging nor discouraging contact, understanding that this was between Daniel and the twins, and her role was to support whatever they decided. She filed for divorce in July 2018, citing abandonment. The proceedings were uncontested. Daniel signed every document without protest. In March 2020, Daniel was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease. The tremor in his left hand, which he'd attributed to stress and overwork, was progressive and degenerative. The neurologist who delivered the diagnosis, a woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized in movement disorders, explained that the condition would worsen over time, affecting his mobility, his coordination, eventually his ability to work and live independently. Daniel told the twins through Dr. Granger during a mediated session in June 2020, not as a plea for sympathy or forgiveness, but as information they had a right to know. It didn't change much at first. Devon's response was silence. Audrey sent a brief email saying she was sorry he was sick but needed more time. Claire felt a complicated mixture of emotions she couldn't untangle. Anger that he was asking them to care about his suffering after what he'd done. Sadness that the person she'd once loved was facing this. Relief that at least now there was a concrete reason he might need them rather than the other way around. In the spring of 2021, Devon agreed to meet Daniel in person for the first time since the dock at Lake Peyton. It was Dr. Granger's suggestion, and Devon approached it with the grim determination of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than seeking connection. They met at Julia Davis Park in Boise on a Saturday morning in April, the air cool and smelling of fresh-cut grass and cherry blossoms. They sat on a bench overlooking the pond, where families fed ducks and children climbed on playground equipment. They talked about small, safe things. The weather, Devon's classes at community college where he was studying mechanical engineering, a book Devon was reading about the Apollo program. They didn't talk about the 8 years. They didn't talk about betrayal or forgiveness or what it meant that they were sitting there together. After 45 minutes, Devon stood to leave. He looked at Daniel, who had aged more than 8 years in 8 years, whose left hand trembled visibly even when he tried to still it, and said, "I don't forgive you. I don't know if I ever will. But I don't want you to die alone." It was, Daniel later told Dr. Granger, the most generous thing anyone had ever given him, not forgiveness, but the simple acknowledgement of his humanity. Audrey's path was different and slower. She didn't agree to meet Daniel in person until the fall of 2021, nearly a year after Devon's first visit. She chose a coffee shop in downtown Boise, public and neutral, with an easy exit if she needed it. She brought a list of questions written in a spiral notebook, 17 questions, numbered, some crossed out and rewritten. She asked them methodically, taking notes on his answers, her face carefully neutral. Why did you do it? Did you ever think about coming back? Did you love us? How could you love someone else's children while we thought you were dead? Daniel answered every question as honestly as he could, which meant admitting there were things he didn't understand about his own choices, motivations that remained opaque even to him. At the end of 2 hours, Audrey closed her notebook, thanked him for his time with formal politeness, and left. She didn't contact him again for 6 months. When she finally did, it was to tell him she was majoring in psychology at Boise State University, that she wanted to understand how people made incomprehensible choices, that maybe someday she'd understand him, even if she couldn't forgive him. Daniel told her he thought that was good, that understanding was enough, that he didn't deserve forgiveness anyway. Claire moved forward with her own life in the measured, deliberate way someone does after trauma. In 2022, she married a man named Patrick, who taught high school biology and coached the robotics team. He was kind and steady and asked nothing of her past that she wasn't ready to give. He had no children of his own and treated Devon and Audrey with respect, never trying to replace their father, never competing for their affection, simply being present and reliable. They bought a small house on the north end of Boise, with a backyard big enough for a garden. Claire planted tomatoes and basil and zucchini, things that grew predictably, things she could control. She left her job at the nonprofit and started working full-time as a grant writer for the state health department, good pay and benefits and work that felt meaningful. The twins graduated high school in 2021, Devon with honors in math and science, Audrey with a portfolio of photographs that won a regional competition. Claire framed their diplomas and hung them in the hallway and allowed herself to feel proud of the people they'd become, despite everything. Daniel lives now in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Nampa, Idaho, 20 minutes west of Boise. The Parkinson's has progressed, his tremor is more pronounced, his gait unsteady, and he takes medication 4 times a day to manage symptoms. He works part-time at a community re-entry center, helping formerly incarcerated people navigate the bureaucratic maze of housing applications, job searches, and probation requirements. It's work that feels like penance and purpose in equal measure. He attends a support group for men dealing with guilt and accountability, held Tuesday evenings in the basement of a Methodist church, where he listens more than he speaks. He sees Audrey every few months now. She stops by his apartment or they meet for coffee, their conversations gradually becoming less formal, less scripted. She tells him about her classes, her research interests, her plans to apply for graduate school in clinical psychology. She shows him her photographs, black and white images of empty spaces, abandoned buildings, landscapes marked by absence. He sees himself in them, sees the way she's trying to make sense of loss and presence simultaneously. Devon has not seen Daniel since that morning in Julia Davis Park. They exchange occasional text messages, brief, functional, never emotional. Devon is finishing his degree in mechanical engineering, has a girlfriend, is interviewing for jobs with aerospace companies. Daniel doesn't ask to be part of his life. He understands the door may never open further, and he respects that boundary. The paracord bracelet that Daniel wore for 8 years, faded and fraying, sits now in a drawer in Devon's apartment in Boise. Daniel sent it to him through Dr. Granger in the fall of 2020 with a short note that said simply, "You made this for me. I kept it. I'm sorry." Devon hasn't decided what to do with it yet. Some days he thinks about throwing it away, erasing that last physical connection. Other days he thinks about keeping it as evidence, not of love, but of the fact that even in choosing to disappear, his father had carried something of him. Most days he just leaves it in the drawer, unopened, neither kept nor discarded, existing in the same liminal space as his relationship with Daniel. Lake Peyton continues its rhythms unchanged. Every summer, families arrive with coolers and fishing rods and inflatable toys. The water is still the same blue-green. The air still smells like sunscreen and gasoline and the particular scent of algae warming in shallow water. The docks have been replaced and expanded, the marina building renovated, but the essential character of the place remains. Somewhere in the Fremont County Sheriff's Department archives, case file 2009-07-0438 sits in a banker's box marked Resolved, Missing Person, Recovered Alive. The search and rescue volunteers who spent days dragging the lake in July 2009, the divers who worked in zero visibility, the dog handlers who walked endless miles, the deputies who followed every lead no matter how implausible. None of them got the kind of ending that provides emotional satisfaction. There was no body recovered, no dramatic rescue, no villain apprehended. Just a man who walked away from his life in a moment of existential crisis and moral failure, and then lacked the courage to return until circumstance forced the revelation 8 years later. Dr. Granger, who continued working with the family through 2022 before finally closing their case and transitioning them to maintenance-level support, often reflects that cases like Daniel's challenge our fundamental need for neat narratives. We want clear categories: victim or villain, accident or intention, forgivable or unforgivable. Daniel Brennan doesn't fit cleanly into any of those boxes. He made a catastrophic choice that destroyed his family's sense of reality and safety. He caused immeasurable harm, years of ambiguous grief, financial hardship, psychological trauma that will mark Devon and Audrey for life. Those facts are true and unchangeable. But it's also true that he lived with crushing guilt, that he kept a physical reminder of his children even as he built a new life, that he eventually cooperated fully with legal consequences, that he has spent years trying to make whatever amends are possible, knowing full well they will never be adequate. Both things are true, the harm and the remorse, the choice and the consequences. Blair will tell you, if asked, that forgiveness isn't a binary state, isn't a switch you flip that changes everything. It's a long, uneven process that looks different every day, and some days she's further along than others. Some days she can think about Daniel with something approaching neutral acceptance. Other days the anger returns fresh and sharp, as if no time has passed at all. Both states are valid. Both will probably continue. The twins are finding their own paths forward, which is all anyone can ask. They've learned, perhaps earlier and more painfully than most people, that the world is complicated, that people contain multitudes, that harm and love can coexist in the same person, that forgiveness is a choice rather than an obligation, and that moving forward doesn't require resolution of the past. Devon is building a life that has nothing to do with his father. Relationships, career, identity, all constructed independently. Audrey is building a life that tries to understand her father's actions within a broader framework of human psychology and trauma. Neither approach is wrong. Both are survival strategies, ways of integrating an experience that can't be changed or forgotten. If you or someone you know is navigating the aftermath of a loved one's disappearance, resources exist. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System provides databases, support, and coordination between agencies. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children offers services for families and survivors. The Center for Grief and Trauma specializes in ambiguous loss, that particular kind of mourning without closure that affects families of the missing. Local support groups exist in most cities, offering connection with others who understand what it means to live with unresolved absence. Therapy, particularly trauma-informed therapy, can provide tools for processing experiences that resist simple narratives. Ambiguous loss is real, documented, studied, and treatable. You don't have to face it alone. Daniel Brennan's story is not a redemption arc. Redemption requires a kind of restoration that isn't possible here. But it is a story about consequences and accountability, about living with choices that can't be undone, about the long, slow work of trying to make amends, knowing they will never be sufficient. It's a story about a family learning to live with complexity, with the coexistence of love and harm, with the absence of the clean ending our culture teaches us to expect. And it's a story that continues, incomplete and ongoing, because that's what life looks like when you can't erase the past, but have to find a way to live in the present anyway. The lake remembers nothing. The water reflects whatever sky is above it. Families still come, still fish, still make memories that will become the anchors of their own stories. And somewhere in Boise and Nampa, 5 people connected by blood and trauma and history continue the work of being alive, of moving forward, of carrying what they must, and setting down what they can.